Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I got an interesting comment on my video about why I don't debate atheists, which I think it's a good question, and the answer I think is interesting enough to make a video about, so that's what I'm doing. Here's the comment I got. I am an atheist, and I have questions. How do you define God? What are his attributes? If you say things like he is timeless or spaceless, the whole Kalam deal, then I have a follow-up question. Do you really believe that? Because I personally can't even grasp what a timeless, spaceless being could even be, and I have a hard time believing that anyone actually believes in the Kalam definition. Okay, so first off, the definition I like to use is the uncreated creator of all that is. It uniquely specifies God, and then it's possible to argue over properties afterwards, like whether God is a triune being in Christianity, or or monistic. I forget the proper term for it, but in Islam or Judaism. So it uniquely specifies. So we all hold this to be the uncreated creator of all that is. We just argue over properties. So now, when it comes to the properties, what I like to use is the properties demonstrated from the argument from contingency, which is the third way St. Thomas has in the Summa Theologica. It's distinct from the Kalam cosmological argument, by the way, because the Kalam cosmological argument, actually as the name implies, the Kalam cosmological argument relies on the universe having a beginning, which you don't actually find in St. Thomas. He specifically, there's no requirement. You can prove God without the universe having a beginning, so he omitted that. As the name Kalam implies, it actually came from Islamic theology, that argument about how the universe had a beginning. Just to give a very super quick sketch, because I'm not going to demonstrate the argument from contingency, but just to point out, if you look at the moments of time are somehow together, but there's nothing inherently that makes them. One moment of time doesn't contain all subsequent moments of time, otherwise it would be timeless, since all subsequent moments of time would already be together. So something somehow puts these moments of time together, that is to say their conjunction with each other is contingent on something. And then you can work that contingency back, and you can see there that you would need you can't have an actual infinity that exists simultaneously like that, because these things are put together by something, or they would not be put together. You can't have the other one either, for the same reason. You can't have infinite time stretching back, for the same reason you can't traverse the negative integers in order. But that's a very mathy thing that I think most people don't like, and it doesn't matter for the moment, because it's irrelevant whether or not there were an infinite number of moments in time. The moments of time being together have to be dependent on something. So they are contingently together, and then you trace that back until you find something which is non-contingent. Otherwise, you'd have contingency with nothing making it happen, and time wouldn't exist, but it clearly does. All right, that non-contingent thing is God. That necessary thing is God. Right. Now, again, that's not a proof. I'm going over this to explain where I am coming from, to make what I believe intelligible. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything here. Okay, so that's the argument from contingency, and showing God to be a necessary being as opposed to a contingent being reveals a number of things about God. For example, that God doesn't have any divisible parts. That is to say, separable parts capable of existing independently. Like my right hand and my left hand could exist independently of each other. So, for example, if you cut off my right hand and throw it in an incinerator, my left hand will still exist. It won't, in that moment wink out of existence. They are separable from each other. And from my body, as, the fact that you can cut them off clearly indicates. In God, there are no separable parts, because if they're separable parts, they must be together for some reason. Something must have put them together, and therefore their conjunction is contingent on something. And God is not contingent, therefore God has no parts. This is what's meant by saying God is simple in a metaphysical sense. God does not have any parts to him. God is therefore perfectly happy, because God lacks nothing. Since there are no parts, there can't be a missing part, and therefore God cannot be missing anything to make him happy. Therefore, God doesn't need us, because God is perfectly happy. So we cannot possibly add anything to God. It therefore follows that the only reason God could have created us is for our sake, not for his. This is what is meant by the phrase God is love. That is to say, God is pure generosity because God simply cannot receive. We can metaphorically talk about giving our lives to God or what have you, but that means using them according to God's intention for us, not actually benefiting God in any way. Further, it also indicates the argument from contingency. It follows from that God does not change. Because change is the coming into being of something that was not in existence, or the fading out of being of something that had been in existence. Now you can see this even like in the local motion of electrons as they move towards each other. There is now greater force pushing on them than there had been before. As they move apart, there is less force pushing on them than there had been before. In more macro things, which frankly are more natural, like a child, being conceived is the creation of something. There are now a thing that exists that hadn't before. Again, change. It's the coming into being or the fading out. If you have no parts, none of them can come into being, nor can they fade out. Okay, so it follows from the fact that God does not change that God is timeless. God is outside of time. Time is the creation of God. God is not inside of time. All moments, therefore, are equally present to God. This is, by the way, how God can both know the future and for there to be free will, because all of our free decisions are, in fact, present to God at all times. All moments are equally present to God because God stands outside of time. The common analogy to that is like the author of a book, who can, in writing page 1, know what happens on page 173, because you can just flip to them and then flip back and then flip and flip back, because all pages are, to us who are in time, potentially equally present to the author. As an analogy, that's an analogy of something in time, having essentially a different timeline. God has no timeline. God is outside of time, but there's still that timeline and God, and there's no actual space between them, by the way. Just all analogies and all metaphors have their limitations. Okay, now it should be noted that this does not mean that God's interactions with us do not change. My favorite analogy for this, and by the way, everything said about God is because God has a completely different mode of being from us. We are contingent, he is non-contingent. Everything said, and all human language is developed from within our life of contingency, from within time, where everything is contingent. So all human language is built to refer to contingent things, and we can only make analogies to God. We can make analogies, it's not that we can't say anything about God, but everything we say has to be an analogy. So, about a useful analogy for showing that God being timeless and changeless does not mean that his interactions with us in time do not change. Consider a lens. Okay, if a lens does not... Okay, so there's the light bouncing off the thing, and a lens then changes how the light arrives somewhere. The lens does not change the thing where the light's bouncing off of it, or emitting it in the case of like a light bulb or what have you. That is not changing, and yet the lens is causing its interactions with other things to change. I actually happen to own a Fresnel lens. So if I do this with the Fresnel lens, my interaction with the video has changed even though I am not moving any closer, and yet my face gets bigger. So the light coming off of me is not changing. It is still focused, it's still scattering in exactly the same way, but by there being something else that is, related to the camera and, not part of me, it is possible, and then depending on where it is, that changes things. And so you can see in this analogy, this lens, Fresnel lens, by the way, they're awesome. This thing is able to change my interaction with something, even though I am not changing there. I mean, obviously, my lips are moving and stuff, and I can't hold perfectly still. You can do the same thing with the sun, by the way. Just hold the lens up. You can focus the light into a little point. You can change it and scatter the light, further, so you actually get a shadow and so on. And so, in that same way, you're not changing the sun, but you are changing the sun's interactions with things. In the same way as we interact, this is an analogy, and all analogies are inexact and only apply in part, not every part of them. That's what makes them analogies rather than exactitudes. In a similar way, things in time, as we move, we are, in some sense, acting like lenses for God's interaction with the world, changing how God interacts with the world because his interactions are being focused, refocused, blurred, etc. through our actions. So God's changing interactions with the world come about through the world's changing, not through God changing. But because the world changes, God's interactions with it change. Okay. All right, so do I believe this? Yes, I do. This brings up a very important distinction, which is not too commonly made. I like to use the words comprehension and understanding, because it comes from the physical metaphor. To comprehend something is to be able to fit it inside your head, to be able to get your mind entirely around it. To understand something is just to be able to stand under it. So, for example, I can't encircle the ceiling with my arms. It's too big. I can't do it. I'm too small. But I can stand under it. That works. So, in this distinction, I'm using understanding to mean to be able to know what we as finite limited beings are capable of knowing something, versus comprehension being to be able to fit it entirely inside of our mind. Sort of the it's not as a definition, but sort of the difference between them is something we can comprehend, we can imagine, because something we imagine is entirely inside of our mind. Something we merely understand, however, is something we can't imagine, but nonetheless know properties of in a real sort of way. Now, there are lots of things in this life that we understand but do not comprehend. Starting with physics, gravity is the curvature of space-time. This is understandable, it makes sense in that way. It is not in the least comprehensible. That, we've all seen those pictures, right, of the bowling ball, on the mattress, or the bowling ball on the rubber sheet, where, the heavy thing depresses it and the light thing doesn't so much, and, things want to roll in. But that's not actually, that's cheating, because there's a gravitational field that makes things want to fall down. In real life, we have 3 dimensions, and heavy bodies warp things in all 3 dimensions, and it's not possible to comprehend space getting smaller and versus bigger, but still in some sense being the same space, but not actually being the same space. And then when you push it further to why is it that an object falls? Because in theory, the reason why when I let this go is that unsupported, its shortest path through space-time, given the curvature of space, local to it, was to move relative to everything else. It's understandable as an idea. I've seen the equations. I haven't worked through them. I haven't learned enough tensor calculus. I've seen enough tensor calculus and done enough of the prerequisites. I could learn it if I put 6 months into it. Grad school, probably a little longer. Grad school was a while ago now. But nonetheless, though you can understand it in that sense, you can reason about it and think about it and, draw inferences from it. You can, conclude that it is true on the basis of other things. You can't imagine the shortest path through space-time being falling. There's no analog in our normal experience to the shortest path for the shortest path for a stationary object is to move. It's metaphorical language. It's analogical language. It doesn't refer to anything in our experience. It sort of points at it to help us get a sense of how to understand the thing properly, but we don't in any sense comprehend it. Think about atoms, for example, which are really astonishingly complex things where you have a bunch of standing waves in fields called subatomic particles like quarks and gluons and so on. There are a lot of things inside just an atom. These things, several of these things stick to each other really, really tightly and form protons, and some of the other ones, some of the same ones, some of the different ones, stick to each other really tightly and form neutrons. And these things bind to each other really hard, even though they kind of want to be pushed apart too. And all of those things stick to each other incredibly, phenomenally hard. And then there are a bunch of electrons, which are actually at the same level as quarks, which orbit them in some sense that doesn't mean spinning around, because the Bohr model of the atom is I understand it from having read up on quantum mechanics, completely wrong. The way the physicist I was reading put it was that any insight you gain from the Bohr model of the atom is incorrect. It's only correct in things that it gives you no insight into. So, so in some sense these things are around. They're the wave-particle duality. In some sense they're stuck to it. You find them around it. Now, that thing will stick to another one of those things, forming things like molecules. And if you get a whole lot of these things, they then will form, an actual large, well, molecules don't really make sense in organic chemistry sense. Like molecule doesn't make much sense in like crystalline structures, for example, but whatever. So take, rubber. So, take a tire that's made out of rubber. Then you've got these, large things here. And then as the tire is spinning around, going down the road at 60 miles an hour, somehow these things are orbiting each other and they're all pushing on each other. And all of this stuff is all working around as the orientation is changing and they're moving really quite fast. They're moving at, more than 100,000 times their own length per second. I mean, they're moving really fast compared to the size of them. Try to imagine that. Try to actually comprehend what's going on, and you can't. It doesn't work. You can understand it. It all makes sense. It is believable. You can produce very good evidence that this is in fact what's going on. You can draw very useful conclusions from knowing that this is what's going on. You cannot comprehend this. Calculus is another example. I've got a math background. In calculus, take the differentiation, right? So you've got the derivative of a function. For those who don't know, so you've got, your function, and the derivative is the tangent line to the function at that point, which is the rate of change of the function at that point, or more properly, the limit of the rate of change of the function as it approaches that point. Because say for a curve, like let's say you're looking at, negative x squared or something. That tangent line does not actually tell you where that function is going because that tangent line only touches it at one point. It does not actually touch any other point. So if you follow that line, you will not be on the function. So it means the rate of change of the function, except in a sense it doesn't. It doesn't mean it in the sense that like the function actually changes that way. It's somehow... there's some old language. There's a great description I read of this from about 200 years ago about how the derivative doesn't make any sense. That it was called a nascent augment, or an incipient celerity. A celerity coming from the Latin celeritas, like velocity. And you're saying, no, if you think you can understand that, and it was great too because they're called a fluxion. The derivative is more recent language. So if you can understand the first fluxion, consider the second fluxion, or what we would call a second derivative, which is the nascent augment of a nascent augment, the incipient celerity of an incipient celerity. It had this great line, what are we considering but the ghost of a departed quantity? But the point being, if the first derivative makes any sense to you, the second derivative, the rate of change of the rate of change, in some sense, you can understand what it is saying about the function, but you cannot comprehend what it is saying about the function. There's no way you can imagine what on earth this means, since you're not talking, you're talking about the rate of change of a thing which doesn't even tell you where the function is. And then try the third derivative, and the fourth derivative, and the fifth derivative. You can keep understanding these things. These things keep making sense that way. They are understandable, but they are not in any sense comprehensible. You can describe their properties. You can use these properties according to your descriptions. You can draw useful knowledge from them. You can't imagine it. You can't comprehend it. And if you try, I recommend trying, by the way. Like, take any of these things. If you study any math, most of it, I really recommend that. Try that. Try actually comprehending them. Like the one of my favorites is the proof that there is many numbers between 0 and 1 is between 0 and 2 in the real numbers. And it's very simple. You can come up with a 1-to-1 and onto mapping. You just, for every, for x in 0 to 1, from your perspective, 0 to 1, you map it to 2x. So, 0 to 2. So for every number in 0 to 1, it has a place it goes. For every number in 0 to 2, there's a place it comes from. So there's nothing left off when you map 0 to 1 to 0 to 2. And yet it is also a strict subset. What does that mean, that 0 to 1 is a strict subset of 0 to 2, and yet you can establish a 1-to-1 and onto correspondence between the elements? Because, normally, the same number of things here and here, we count them, line them up, and if they, if everyone matches and there isn't more, any left over, they're the same number. So you can come up with functions that do this, where you can match up the elements, and yet the one is a strict subset of the other. It's mind-boggling in the sense of you can't comprehend it, though it's very straightforward to understand. It's the work of Georg Cantor, by the way, and others. Very little is the work of purely one person ever, but anyhow, he's most famously associated with this, and the cardinalities of infinity and so on, like the way that there's many primes as there are even numbers as there are natural numbers. and so on. Great stuff. It's fascinating. I love math. I recommend it tremendously, especially that stuff. But again, it's all great examples of things you can understand in the sense of you can describe their properties, you can see the properties are true, you can draw useful inferences from these properties, but you can't comprehend it. Now, probably the most familiar example is time. How does one moment change into the next? What's actually happening as, a moment ticks over into another moment? And, that ticks over is, itself a metaphor from clocks. We don't know. I mean, we know that time works, clearly. There are a few people that doubt it. But, for most of us, we understand that time functions. We understand, in a sense, how time functions. Not quite as well as we thought as Einstein demonstrated, but nonetheless, we have a basic and useful understanding of time. But we have no comprehension of time. We have no direct knowledge of what on earth is happening, how the future becomes the present and the present becomes the past. It's incomprehensible. It happens. We're all incredibly familiar with it. It's obviously true. It's here. We know lots of things about it. But it's utterly incomprehensible. You can't actually imagine this if you try directly to do so. So now I'd like to point out, as I talk about these things being incomprehensible, I am not making a God of the Gaps argument, just because this is the internet. I am not trying to say, therefore, it is God who does these things. My entire point rests on the idea that you can understand but not comprehend these things, that they are true but incomprehensible, and that they are not, in a direct sense God, but rather they are things in our experience, really genuinely in our experience, which are true and understandable, but not at all comprehensible. You can't imagine them at all. So, this is true also of God. We can, as I showed, you can reason about God and his principles. We can understand God, not in the sense of comprehending God, because we absolutely cannot comprehend God, but we can understand God in that metaphorical sense of standing under, of sort of putting our head in the right relationship to God, that we can, there are things about God we can know, and we can know those things. We can't know everything, that would be comprehension, but we can know some things, and it is possible to know those things that we can know. So, you can reason about God from these things. You can then also see, incidentally, in the context of Christianity, that these properties of God, like that God cannot need us, that God has to have created us for our sake, not for his, are very consonant with everything you find in Christianity about how, as St. James said, God is love. That is to say, God is generosity. And, that outflowing of, that infinite outflowing of being contingent on nothing, lacking nothing. It's incredibly consonant with natural theology. And you find this in the Summa Theologica, because one common thing will be like, okay, fine, suppose the argument from contingency, proves something, but how do you know that's God in like the Christian sense? Well, there's a reason why the Summa Theologica is 5 volumes long, and in small print, and it's fairly big. So, if you want to work out natural theology, you can reason quite a lot from this. It's happened. It's not easy, especially not, the Summa Theologica is, kind of for historical reasons, it is a magnificent, amazing work. And one reason why people don't tend to duplicate it over again is anyone who can understand it can just go and read the Summa. That's not quite true. It actually would be valuable if someone did essentially make a Summa in non-scholastic terminology. Because it's not just a matter of, translating a lot of words that they had in scholastic philosophy we simply don't have in English or, most any, ordinary language, simply because they're concepts that aren't particularly useful to refer to in ordinary language. If we need to refer to them, we'll say a lot of sentences. When you're doing philosophy, you don't want to have to say a lot of sentences over and over, so you come up with, specific terms to mean these things. But it means you have to learn an entire vocabulary before the thing becomes comprehensible, because it's written like that, because the alternative would be 50 times as long. So unfortunately, there isn't a very accessible version, because the Summa is so incredibly good, and it'd be a very daunting thing to try to write essentially a modern translation of the Summa Theologica into vernacular, because, well, how could you ever be that good? So there's some things, by just being works of incredible brilliance, that sort of by then historical accident make themselves harder to be accessible. So that's an unfortunate thing about the Summa. It's not easy to get through. It's very slow. If you're sincere, though, and willing to put in, reading, half a page a day for, a year or two, you can get an amazing amount out of it. There's some really brilliant reasoning in it. It's not easy. And I don't expect most people to do that, by the way. Philosophy is not for most people. So that's the thing. Like it's not for it. So if you're interested, if you're the sort of person who needs this, then probably it's for you, and that means you've got a ton of very hard work ahead of you because you're the sort of person who needs it, so it's sort of your obligation to do it. Most people don't need that, ton of grinding, very difficult work, and so it's not really for them. And most people understand things on a more intuitive level, and don't need a sort of, precise exactitude, which grinds pretty much everybody down. Just those of us who need that sort of exacting detail get ground down a lot less because we're getting satisfied at the same time. Okay, so to essentially sum up, God is not comprehensible. God is incomprehensible, but God is understandable. We can understand these things, though we cannot comprehend them. And the thing is, this is also true of our daily experience. There are a lot of things in life which are true, which we can understand, but we cannot comprehend. We cannot fathom them. We can't tell how deep they are, from fathoming. But nonetheless, we can know things about them, and we know that they are true. And so actually, it's a very good sign that this idea of God is incomprehensible but understandable, because it is the creator of a universe which is incomprehensible but understandable. So it fits. So, yes, that's what I believe, and portion thereof, and how it is that I believe this thing, despite it being incomprehensible. In short, because it fits with a world that, as I've studied quite a lot, I have found has some very incomprehensible parts that are certainly understandable. So, I recommend that. Concentrate on things to get some, to really get some experience with things that are incomprehensible but understandable. Really push yourself hard, push yourself to the breaking point of trying to comprehend them until you feel like either you're going to give up or you're going to go insane. Then give up and don't go insane. Like I'm talking about like the math thing, right? Not religious stuff, secular stuff. Do this in secular things. Like the same number of numbers between 0 and 1 and 0 and 2. Try to comprehend that. Try to really actually comprehend that, and then give up before you go insane. And then realize, and then move on to some other things. You don't want to ever draw a conclusion from just one fact. So, move on to other things, find other things in the world, like try to really comprehend time. Study physics and try to really comprehend what's being said there. You can understand it, and once you find a bunch of things that you can understand but not comprehend, I think then this idea of God will also make a lot of, much more intuitive sense to you, because it'll just be one more thing that you can't comprehend, but you can understand. And in point of fact, if you could comprehend the creator of an incomprehensible thing, it's a pretty good sign that's not actually the creator of it. So, all right. Hope this was interesting, or helped, or, at least answered this question for the person who asked it and anyone else who might have it. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I got an interesting comment on my video about why I don't debate atheists, which I think it's a good question, and the answer I think is interesting enough to make a video about, so that's what I'm doing. Here's the comment I got. I am an atheist, and I have questions. How do you define God? What are his attributes? If you say things like he is timeless or spaceless, the whole Kalam deal, then I have a follow-up question. Do you really believe that? Because I personally can't even grasp what a timeless, spaceless being could even be, and I have a hard time believing that anyone actually believes in the Kalam definition. Okay, so first off, the definition I like to use is the uncreated creator of all that is. It uniquely specifies God, and then it's possible to argue over properties afterwards, like whether God is a triune being in Christianity, or or monistic. I forget the proper term for it. But in Islam or Judaism. So it uniquely specifies, so we all hold this to be the uncreated creator of all that is, we just argue over properties. So now when it comes to the properties, what I like to use is the properties demonstrated from the argument from contingency, which is the third way St. Thomas has in the Summa Theologica. It's distinct from the Kalam cosmological argument, by the way, because the Kalam cosmological argument, actually as the name implies, the Kalam cosmological argument relies on the universe having a beginning, which you don't actually find in St. Thomas. He specifically, there's no requirement. You can prove God without the universe having a beginning, so he omitted that. It's as the name Kalam implies, it actually came from Islamic theology. That argument about how the universe had a beginning. Just to give a very super quick sketch, because I'm not going to demonstrate the argument from contingency, but just to point out, if you look at the moments of time are somehow together, but there's nothing inherently that makes them. One moment of time doesn't contain all subsequent moments of time, otherwise it would be timeless, since all subsequent moments of time would already be together. So something somehow puts these moments of time together, that is to say their conjunction with each other is contingent on something. And then you can work that contingency back, and you can see there that you would need an actual, you can't have an actual infinity that exists simultaneously like that, because these things are put together by something, or they would not be put together. You can't have the other one either, for the same reason. You can't have infinite time stretching back, for the same reason you can't traverse the negative